for Live Wellington. And tonight I want to talk about a trip I took to North Carolina to attend the Congress for New Urbanism and talk about what new urbanism is, how it could be applicable for Wellington, for Live Wellington, and also what I gleaned from being in Charlotte. So I guess the kind of first question is why might I have gone, why might I have cared about going to this conference? So I stumbled upon new urbanism on the internet and thought this sounds like something that is very akin to what Live Wellington is trying to be, and maybe we could all benefit from learning a bit more from this. And when I found out about the conference and all the tours they're offering and the talks, it really sounded like something I would love to be a part of. So I thought, just dang it, I'm just going to get on a plane and go over there. So I did. And it was fantastic. It was a really good experience, and I feel like I did learn a lot in a short space of time. So really keen to share that with you and have a conversation about how it's relevant. And it's not completely relevant for Wellington, but some of it is. So just kicking off, just trying to understand what new urbanism is, it's really helpful to understand the context. So can you see? Yeah, okay. So really it was a reaction to what was the changes that were happening in the United States. So pre-war, so a lot of the new urbanists will talk about the pre-war kind of times. Cities were built around mixed uses, and they tended to be walkable because there weren't as many cars. And after World War II, cities obviously started to grow in a different way, and they started to segregate the residential areas from the commercial and the industrial development. And people started moving out into the suburbs because they had cars, and that meant a whole different kind of development. And this created some tension, and Jane Jacobs was quite well known in New York for standing up against the changes that were happening, particularly to Greenwich, which was the area she lived in. There was going to be a motorway that would have taken out basically Soho. And she was a journalist. She wasn't an urban designer or anything like that, but she started talking about this and how great the local neighbourhoods were because of the vibrancy of the mixed use areas, and how putting an expressway through it was just going to wreck that. So she was hugely influential, and she wrote the book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and ended up being a huge inspiration for new urbanism. And as I said, because of cars, particularly in America, and due to the perception that inner cities were places of crime and pollution, people wanted to move out into the suburbs. And so there's a kind of hollowing out of the inner cities and people moving out into suburbs. And that, of course, then reinforced the fact that you really needed cars to get around, which led to this car dependence around in America, and of course we see it in New Zealand as well. So new urbanism was kicked off by a couple of people who worked in an architectural practice called DPZ, Andres Duani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, and they started observing what they eventually called the traditional neighbourhood development. And basically they identified how the suburbs that they were seeing were quite deficient in a number of ways, and how some of the older setups, the older structures of the suburbs were far superior. So they started experimenting with some of these ideas and founded the Congress for New Urbanism in 1993. And this has become actually very influential in the United States and influences real estate as well as urban planning and land use strategies within councils. So what is a traditional neighbourhood pattern? So some of the aspects that they identified about these traditional neighbourhoods that they thought were really great were they had a discernible centre often with a transit stop. Most dwellings are within a 5-minute walk of the centre, which is roughly a quarter of a mile or 0.4 of a kilometre. And there's a variety of dwellings there, so that all kinds of people can live there. And there's shops and offices in the area. And the streets tend to be narrower, and the buildings are close to the street, and parking often is at the back. And they actually designed one area that became quite well known called Seaside in Florida. And it actually featured in the movie The Truman Show, which makes you think in a way, well, that's kind of quite twee and cheesy. But actually Seaside, even to this day, apparently is quite a tourist destination. So since then, they've gone on to design lots of other areas as well, but that's one that's often held up as sort of the first example of new urbanism. So the Charter for New Urbanism is here, and basically saying that neighbourhoods should be diverse in use and population. Communities should be designed for the pedestrian and transit as well as for the car. Cities and towns should be shaped by physically defined and universally accessible public spaces and community institutions. Urban places should be framed by architecture and landscape design that celebrate local history, climate ecology, and building practice. And they also have 27 principles of new urbanism, which I won't go through, but you can look them up on the internet if you're interested. But of interest are things like there should be a broad range of housing within neighbourhoods, and activities for daily living should occur within a walking distance. So the Congress for New Urbanism takes place every year, although it was interrupted by COVID. And the one in Charlotte was the first one they'd had for a number of years. So this is the one that I attended. And it's 4 to 5 days of conferences plus tours around the city, and talks and get-togethers in different forms. And so it was in Charlotte in a big hotel there. So I'll just talk a little bit about Charlotte itself, which is probably a city I would never have gone to had it not been for this particular conference. So just in case you're wondering where Charlotte is, it's over there on the eastern side of the United States. And I'll just zoom in here. So it's actually quite a big metropolitan area of more than 2 million people in the wider area. The city itself apparently only has around 800,000 people, but it certainly has the feeling of a very big city. And it was founded back in 1755 by the European settlers, and its initial prosperity was based on gold. And then cotton processing. So there's quite a few factories left around from the cotton processing days. So of course, when a city hosts the Congress for New Urbanism, and it does move around every year, they want to show off their best and biggest projects. So of course, we saw the best side of Charlotte was shown to us. But that's fine, that was good. I'll just go through some of the different areas of Charlotte, so you get a sense of what the city was like. The transit stop near me for the light rail was called Brooklyn Village, and yet I was in the middle of sort of skyscrapers, really, and I thought that's weird. But I found out that actually Brooklyn Village had been in a historic black suburb that had basically been bulldozed to create the central city zone. But there were some remnants left, which I got a few photographs, and just these beautiful old brick buildings. Really, the detail on them was amazing. And there was quite a good virtual reality tour that you could go and see what had been there in the past. You hold your phone up, and they would show you the people and the buildings that used to be there. So that was interesting. But actually, it sort of looks more like this. It's kind of quite sterile in a way, with this is a centre of Charlotte with high rises and big motorways. And certainly they have their big roads, which are, you try to cross a road, it can take you sort of half a minute really to get across. And also, someone pointed out to me that they have these mansions, and so this is when I went to find a mall. So the other thing weirdly about Charlotte is that in the central city zone, there was no retail at all. There were no shops. So if you wanted to buy a pair of socks or something, you just couldn't, which I found extraordinary. And so being a bit of a shopper, I had to go to a very large mall on my final day. And on the way, I saw these houses, and someone at the conference had said, "Look out for the McMansions," and certainly they were extraordinary. So I took all these photographs out the window of the Uber. But these are all newish buildings, but they're sort of built in this old style. So, and apparently, what often happens is two properties will be put together to create a large enough area for a large house. But closer to town, there was a historic area called Fourth Ward, which I took a walk around, and it was really delightful. I have to say, these extraordinary old sort of pastel buildings, really quite neat, quite unusual styles. So yes, I certainly took a few photographs of those. Another area of Charlotte was called Wilmore, and this was what they called a kind of streetcar district. So one of the first areas that had been developed when they put in streetcars so people get a little bit further out of town. And so this was a walk that I went on, and the talk was about looking after historic areas. So these were their examples of historic buildings. I guess what we would call character buildings, but they didn't seem that old to me, really. So I was kind of intrigued by this, but they found that was quite important to them, and it was certainly something they were looking to preserve. One other photograph I took was this building. This is a large old shop, and they wanted to move it to another location, and I was intrigued by this because it's all brick and it's enormous, and I just thought the idea of moving that would be quite hard work. But part of the theme of that particular walk I went on was some of the pressure that's happening on historic areas because people want to intensify, and that's sort of an example of the sort of a denser house going up. I think they call them quadplexes. They have these duplexes and quadplexes and triplexes. So this was an example of a slightly more densely built house that was going up. Another tour I went on was an example of affordable housing being built. And this area had previously been a whole housing development that had not been successful. And basically all the land had been, I guess, owned by one owner. And I didn't get to see a picture of how it was before, but it was deemed not to be very nice. So basically they bulldozed the whole lot and rebuilt it all. So here were some examples they were showing off of how you would have standalone housing alongside denser housing, and sorry, I'm in your way there, denser housing, and it was fitting together quite nicely. It was all sort of looking in a similar style. And there's some other examples of the denser housing that they were building there that was seen as a bit more affordable. And this was another example they held up of new urbanism in what they call first ward. And so houses that are reasonably close together, usually 2 stories, 2 or 3 stories. But often it was very hard for me to see whether these buildings were old or new, because as you can see, they like to build them in this sort of old-fashioned style. So it was intriguing, and I often really couldn't tell what I was looking at. Now, one of the things that Charlotte was very proud of was the fact that they had recently passed their 2040 comprehensive plan, which I guess is probably akin to our district plan. And it was narrowly voted in and quite controversial. And I did laugh. Someone mentioned that they the caves, the citizens against virtually everything, anything, had. But they saw it as very necessary because they are expecting large population growth over the coming years. And so one of the things that I was intrigued about when I was trying to understand it more while I was there was it appears they have quite strict zoning there in the US, and you either have a single family house or you it's apartments. So the move is to have more flexible zoning and allow these kind of townhouses effectively to be built rather than just single family dwellings. And it was seen as quite a step forward. But they also had plans about protecting the charm of the area and building 10-minute neighbourhoods. So I want to talk about light rail. So this was, I went on this light rail quite a few times because it was very convenient to my hotel, and there was quite a few talks along this. So this is the blue line, and it is 19 miles long or 31 kilometres, and it has 26 stops. And it was the region's first light rail, and it opened in 2007. And just in terms of costs, we've all heard about light rail and how much it costs. So initially they thought it was going to be, is that right? I'm not sure that's right. 8.2 million, that can't be right. But anyway, less than a year later, it was 331 million. And then a couple of years later, it was 427 million. So quickly the costs were getting higher. And it was the first rail since they had the original streetcar back in 1938. So their ridership is 27,000 people daily, and it costs $2.20 for a trip. However, you don't go through a turnstile or anything like that. Basically, you are supposed to have an app on your phone where you've paid your fare and you just get on the train, which is fantastic. So I had paid, or I got it free through the conference, I suppose. But actually, no one checked the whole time, so I could have been traveling for free, and I'm sure that many people probably take the risk and do that. But it was very easy to use, and I'll show you a few photographs along the rail. So as I was explaining earlier to these guys, the track actually had been a heavy rail track in the past, and it was abandoned. So I think it was related to the cotton processing of the past. So they had an existing track, which of course made their lives a lot more easy when it came to reinstating light rail. But despite that, it took quite a few years to get the agreement to go with light rail, and they eventually did. And it has been, well, I'll just go through a few photographs. I just sucked this in. I sort of surreptitiously took a photograph of this person on the train because it was just reminded when this guy rolled onto the train on his wheelchair how much easier it is if you're in a wheelchair to get onto a train than trying to struggle with a bus. So what a fantastic degree of freedom you have when you light rail, just that ease of getting on. That's one of the trains. And it has seen the rejuvenation of the south end of Charlotte, which is an area which was previously, I think, a lot of warehouses and not really populated by people. So according to one description, South End was the old warehouse district you didn't want to be 20 years ago. The only thing it had going for it was Charlotte's historic neighbourhoods on each side. Fast forward 20 years and the towering landscapes of South End have run out of warehouses to turn into mid-rise office and multifamily blocks. So it's a really attractive place for people to be now. And I just put that map in to show you how far away it was, because I think it's sort of important. So I was there in the Western, and the South End is there. So it's sort of about, if you were walking, it would be about 20 minutes or something like that. But actually, there's this massive motorway in the middle, so you almost can't get there. So that's about how far it was from the middle of town. But the other thing that was actually almost more attractive, and the thing that the people of Charlotte were really proud of, was this rail trail. And this was the trail that had previously been the sort of service line alongside the rail. And they've made it into a walking trail with lots of artworks along the side, and bars, cafes, and that kind of thing. So this was a little tour I went on in and of itself, walking along the rail trail. And as I say, artworks have been a really important part of it as well. And now people are actually apparently advertising their apartments to say, we're near the rail trail. This is a really cool, place to be. So they've got these neat little interactive things you can do, seesaws and things, and there's bikes you can take along. So as well as traveling on the light rail itself, people are traveling alongside the light rail, either actively, walking, scootering, or cycling. And they've got these neat shops. So often they are older buildings that have been repurposed. Some sort of cool bars, and some other views, and quite a nice mix of heights. So some high rise, but other low rise buildings as well. And quite trendy sort of shops. And what I heard was the tech companies are the ones that are moving in there, because of course the younger people want to live in this cooler environment. And compared to Uptown, which is, to be honest, a bit sterile and sort of, glass skyscrapers, this area was a much nicer area to be living in and working in. So it was quite attractive, you could see, for a younger generation. So a lot of new housing being built, of different kinds. And some other examples, most of it good quality and quite attractive, it seemed to me. I was interested, I took this photograph because it seemed like it was, people are walking alongside and you're just sort of sitting there with not much privacy. But that was just one example. So yeah, really, really exciting, and I could see why they were really proud of it. I talked to one person, a New Zealander who lived in Charlotte, and she didn't live anywhere near this. And I sort of talked to her after my tours and things, and she was a bit cynical. She's like, oh, they're investing all this money in the Uptown and all these things along the rail trail. I wouldn't go on that. And so I guess not everyone's convinced, but as a visitor, I thought it was cool. And just some more examples. And certainly construction was underway, and it's a very popular area to be in. It seems like the central city might almost start losing people to this new area. So in terms of other light rail, so light rail, sort of expected to be more on the street. So there was another line there, the sort of green line, where the light rail was more, as you might expect, running alongside the street. But I didn't actually take a ride on that one. And just one other area that is also rejuvenating, which is in the northern area called Noda, and that was another cool kind of area with old brick buildings. Really quite funky. They do well with their murals in Charlotte, so that was cool. So almost done with the tours. Another tour, cycleways. So they are also pretty happy with the work they're doing with cycleways in Charlotte, and you can see why you'd need it, because there's a lot of big wide streets with just cars zooming through. So I was too busy sort of riding my bike to take many photographs, but we did a tour of different kinds of cycleways, and they talked about how successful they had been. Also, in some cases, hadn't managed to get the agreement of the local area for a cycleway, which was interesting to hear as well. Yeah. No, it wasn't composed. No, that's right. And finally, just a stream restoration. So they had this basically this very polluted underground stream, and they decided to daylight it and turn it into a walkway with much more vegetation along, and that's become a beautiful walkway, and certainly, yeah, a lovely place to be. So that was nice to see as well. So those were sort of the examples of the places around Charlotte that they were showing off. So in terms of the conference itself, so there were a range of talks there, some of them quite light and entertaining, some of them really densely about design and a bit more technical. But altogether, I found the conference very accessible, and people were very kind. When I explained I was from New Zealand and I didn't understand all the terminology they have in the United States, they were very good at kind of, explaining that to me. And the theme was the corridor, as in the sort of transit corridor. So there's a lot of talk about transport. So I just want to talk about sort of overall takeaways. So I found that the depth of knowledge and discussion was really great, and it just felt like the urbanism movement there was, of course it's a much bigger country, all that kind of thing, but there's a lot of thought sort of going into it, and it felt like the level of discussion was a lot more mature than it is here. I like the fact that it was a broad church. Not everyone was in agreement. I talked to a guy who was a heritage specialist, and he was going along to a talk by Yimbys, and we were sort of talking about how that was going to turn out. So that they don't all agree on exactly the same thing, but the debate is good, I think. But the impression I got was a lot of the changes that seemed controversial to them, or it seemed like they should happen, but were getting a lot of resistance, seemed quite minor compared to what we're facing here. And when I sort of talked about some of the changes that were happening in New Zealand, they seemed quite taken aback, I thought. I learned some weird things. I just asked my weird questions. So some of you would have seen some of the pictures of the old buildings, and I was saying, do all American buildings have porches? The traditional houses have porches, and they said it's very much a pre-air conditioning kind of thing where people want to sit out on the porch in a hot condition. So, yep, makes sense. From a pedestrian point of view, smaller city blocks are apparently much more pleasant to walk through and much more enjoyable. This is a crazy one. Two-way streets are safer than one-way. So this is from a traffic point of view. Maybe you know this, but you don't have, and I said, like, why? Because you don't have, because you would think you'd have more head-on collisions with cars going in opposite directions. But apparently, cars speed up and they try and take over other cars, and often they don't see pedestrians and they hit them. But the other interesting thing is that if all the cars are going in one direction, you can have crime kind of happening on the side that isn't being seen because it's sort of like a blind spot, which seemed extraordinary, but apparently is proven. Car parking is a useful barrier to protect the pavement, is a new urbanism thing. So they see it as quite a useful thing. And walkable catchments are about figuring out how many people might use your light rail. And so I went to a whole sort of technical discussion on walkable catchments and learned a bit about them. And I haven't checked this one out, but apparently Queen Elizabeth, and I assume it was the first one, set the mile as the length that you could walk in 20 minutes. Did anyone else know that? Okay, is that one? Oh, they were measuring her feet. So okay, all right. So it's great. So sort of getting on to some things that are a bit more relevant to Wellington. So cycling. So as someone said, Copenhagen was not always Copenhagen. So often, people go, we're not Amsterdam, we're not Copenhagen, but, neither was Copenhagen. And so in the 1960s, they were trying to make cities more car friendly. But they made a conscious decision to stop that and actually make them more cycle friendly. And it's taken a long time to get there, but that's paying off now. Climate's not an issue. Some of these big cycling cities are in cold places. So, that's the other thing that people always say, oh, we're not. But having said all that, if there can, we can't, just because cyclists want, perfection, we can't all have perfection, and roads are only so wide. So we all have to compromise, and that's the hard task, isn't it? Character, fake it when you make it. I just, the Americans don't care about whether it's fake old or not. They just, that's good. We talked about Poundbury. I went to a discussion on Poundbury, which is that place in the UK that King Charles has sponsored to build this sort of, which is, the Guardian sort of sniffed at it going, oh, this, fake Georgian town that he's created, which has now become quite popular and successful. But they thought it was marvellous. Poundbury is a wonderful, wonderful place. So, we're quite skeptical about anyone pretending to, make a fake old building. But maybe, we should get over ourselves and just, if we like that, just do it. But the other thing about America, I guess they've got more money or something, but they're quite willing to just bulldoze stuff and start again, which is extraordinary. Pedestrianisation, you aren't Copenhagen. So this is one is a bit controversial perhaps, but I've been reading this great book, which is by Jeff Speck, who was one of the speakers at the conference, called Walkable City, and very much trying to encourage a walkable city and lessen dependence on the car. But even he will say, sometimes you need cars. And there's a good bit in the book that basically says, some cities like Copenhagen and New York can get away with having these pedestrian places and they work. But here's this quote, unless you have, I'll read it out, the full one, unless you have similar residential and pedestrian density in stores that can thrive in the absence of car traffic, a rarity, to consign a commercial area to pedestrians only in America is to condemn it to death. So interesting, given what we're looking at with the Golden Mile. His thought was, if you're going to trial it with temporary bollards, not expensive to remove streetscaping. So you can give it a go, and if it doesn't work, you're not committed. That, mind you, he wrote that a few years ago. This has been reprinted, but still, I'd be interested to know if he stands by that. Density, be like Amsterdam, maybe. So Jan Gehl was mentioned, and as we know, he is all about sort of human scale and that kind of thing. But also in this book, sort of discussion of, well, do you need high rises to have density? And pointing out that a lot of the most pleasant and livable cities like Amsterdam and Paris were built before elevators, so they are, not that high, and you can actually get density without having to have really high buildings. So that's an option, and also, and this is perhaps more in an American context, where they have a lot of open space, and if someone builds one really tall building, it kind of takes up all the development opportunity for that year, and then you've got this sort of everything else that's not developed. So spreading out the development is kind of good. And light rail, whenever I go to a city with light rail, I keep thinking, is this going to work in Wellington? And this is where the walkable catchments come in. So your light rail, these guys in the front are light rail experts, so they'll tell me if I'm wrong about this. But basically, so the idea is people are prepared to walk about 5 minutes to get to a transit stop. Now, I was walking to work this morning and I realised that bus stops are only about 3 minutes 5 minutes apart, really. But light rail, people will walk 5 minutes. So you put them 10 minutes walk apart. So you're never more than 5 minutes away from a stop. According to Queen Elizabeth, we will walk 20 minutes is a mile. So you'd have a transit station every half mile, so every 800 metres. So if we're going to put in light rail to Island Bay, and it's 8k, we'll get about 10 stops. And I took a wild guess at where they could be. So you'd have Wellington Station, maybe one sort of near the TSB Arena, one near Te Papa, one at Courtney Place, one at the Basin Reserve, one at Adelaide Road, one in Newtown, one in Burrenpore, one at the Parade in Island Bay, and then final stop, Island Bay. So I have no idea if that would be correct. So my reflection is that, is anyone going to use that? Wouldn't you rather get on the bus because it'd be more convenient? Because you might have to get off where you actually live rather than a while away. So that's, I still think if we could get the light rail to come in from the coast, in from somewhere else, Johnsonville or Waikanae, then it would be far more useful to get people who are otherwise driving into the city to be coming on a light rail that goes all the way through the city to the airport rather than this. But overall, I actually came back going, God, I'm glad I live here. That's a quote from Jane Jacobs. I went into a cafe, almost on my first day, and there's a quote from Jane Jacobs on the wall, and I was like, oh, that's great. There's no logic that can be imposed on the city. People make it, and it's to them, not buildings, that we must fit our plans. Just a reminder. But Wellington, as I say, it's just in one city, and we all know what America's like, but I think we are very, very lucky to live in this city. It's got a lot going for it: the compactness, the transport systems, the beautiful views, all those things, and also the neighbourhood structures, which in the inner city, I guess we're talking about, which are really, really useful and valuable. And I think we're right to try and retain those, as well as fighting to develop those areas where we can bring more housing. So those are my takeaways from my trip. That's it. Any questions?
What happens in the central city in Charlotte?
So, so in the central city of Charlotte, it's big high rises, and it's a big banking city. So there's a lot of banks domiciled there. So I guess it's all just people driving in, going to work in their offices. There are a few there's restaurants and cafes. People go and have their lunch, but then when they go shopping, I guess they go somewhere else. Interesting. They drive to the mall. Yeah. Stephen.
Speak on the microphone
Ah.
and pass it to the next speaker.
You made the comment about heritage. Like Wellington is quite strong on heritage. Was there much said that would back retaining that, or do you think it's just pull it down, building it?
I think that because America's lost quite a lot of its old buildings, probably the new urbanists in particular see the value of the character of old buildings and the charm that they bring to development. So there was a lot of interest in trying to keep older buildings, but at the same time, I think the natural pressures are that often they are sacrificed. But I didn't. Yeah, I mean, there was people talking about protecting buildings that were from 1927. It's like, oh, that's not that amazing, but whatever.
Just one other thing, pass it over. Just in terms of when they build, like you talked about pulling it down, rebuilding. Was this sort of like extensive areas be done at a time, or like the thing about Wellington is the risk of pepper potting, 6-story building, 6-story bed. Was there any talk about that?
So the one I showed you with the affordable housing, and I was asking that question too. How did you manage to build all this at once? And the answer had been because it was a whole housing development previously that basically owned by one person, so they could do it all at once. So in some cases that happens, and I think that that's been the case where they have, I guess they do these sort of affordable housing areas, and they are rent controlled and maybe owned by the city or owned by particular developers. So there is the opportunity to do it that way. The other examples were in that south end where the new developments occurring, and they were often either high rises or old warehouses that were being converted. So they're bigger sections anyway, I suppose.
Jane, I was quite interested in the number of, I don't think it's working.
It is on the screen.
Oh, it is. Okay, I was quite interested in the number of trees in certain of the neighbourhoods. There were really big mature trees, and there was also that talk about the cleansing the stream and stuff like that. But how much of the conference was actually imbued with a kind of green perspective? I mean, if they're just pulling buildings down, not thinking about sort of embodied carbon and things like that. So how much of a green perspective was articulated through sort of new urbanism?
In terms, and I didn't show probably enough pictures of trees because Charlotte's actually a really green city. It was quite impressive. Not so much a central city, but the all around it was really green. But in terms of the other kind of green, I think people are pretty conscious of it, but they're more talking about climate change, not necessarily from that sustainability point of view of embodied carbon. I think it's more about energy use in a building, that kind of thing, and car use, of course. Yeah. Phil.
Our consultation, do they talk much about consultation and how they develop these plans?
Yes, they did. So quite involved consultation actually, and they proudly. I mean, this is a council talking, so of course they would have their own view, their own skew on it, but they seem to have done very extensive consultation. And in fact, one of the techniques they talked about was having a drive-through consultation. You do that exactly. But so certainly, and I suppose the other thing was, as I sort of mentioned with the cycling, they, in some cases, it appears that residents do have quite a lot of power to say no to things. So you'd have to work for quite a number of years to try and get a group over the line. And if they'd said no, then you wouldn't have to do it, which seems, wow, imagine that. But so it sounded like it was very much by consensus. You had to sort of get that agreement a lot more there. Another thing I found out was with historic areas, it's often driven by the local community, so that you get a certain percentage of the houses in that community who've decided they want to be a historic district, and they sort of self-proclaim themselves that. And once they've done that, they then seem to get someone on the council who sort of looks after them as a historic district, and they're sort of a representative to look after them. So, but I suppose that what that comes with is that you can't then make all those alterations to your house and all that sort of thing. So they have to have that agreement. So it's more driven in the grassroots form than it is here. Tim, I think just got. Oh, sorry, you've got the mic. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Jane, as you know, when you were in Charlotte, I was on a few things really struck me there, and I went to an area called Greendale, which is 2 kilometres from the actual lighthouse. It's an area that used to be absolutely no go. And one of the ways that they were a row house was also a company called Victorian Park. So the city there has made a conscious decision to rejuvenate these areas by, I think, offering some incentives, to people to renovate, etc., but putting on strict height limits as well. It was recognised that a lot more notice taken of heritage, and there is a lot more understanding of exactly what you're talking about around the new urbanism and how important the whole character of the area was, and then the agglomeration, if you like, of the different areas to make up the city.
Yeah.
Rather than a blanket wall.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
thought that was really fascinating, and it was talking to people from all over the political spectrum as well.
Yeah, definitely. And just me testing my ideas, people were very much like, oh, well, you'd have to fit in with the character of the street or the character of the neighbourhood. And yeah, it was just accepted that would be the case. Do you want to just tell me your question, Tim, and I'll repeat it.
Testing.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. That was really fascinating. I'm wondering if at the conference or perhaps from the town officials in Charlotte, was there much talk about the sort of level of decision making, what level of government gets to make the calls on town planning? Because I know there's a bit of a movement in the US to try and push these powers up, to push the state governments in that case to take over town planning. Was that much of a topic of conversation, and where were the views at?
I think, in all honesty, some of that went over my head because trying to understand counties and different areas, it's probably, I didn't tune into that one too much. It appeared that it was being made at the local area, but there might have been some other stuff going on that I just missed. So, yeah.
Somebody up here.
Richard.
Thank you, Jane. One of your slides highlighted the idea of trialing things, a little bit of agility. A couple of years ago, we were introduced to the term, and I figured that there's a little bit of a difference in definition between the way the Americans might think about that and the way we do. I'm not sure. What's your take?
Yeah, I think that is what technical urbanism is, that thing of, just putting in bits and pieces to sort of map it out and see if it works. So, I mean, we have seen that here with some of the cycle lanes, haven't we? Brooklyn one was, effectively, I think, a technical urbanism trial, and now it's being solidified. So I think, yeah, that is happening.
The only thing I observe is that the Americans put quite a bit of an emphasis on the partnership between the community and the authority.
Seem to be a bit more, yeah. Yeah.
Was there any definition of affordable housing?
Yes. Well, that's another one that got pretty complicated because they have sort of rent controlled areas and median incomes, and an affordable house had to be a certain percentage of a median income for that area. So it was very specifically worked out, actually. So I talked to I think it was my Uber driver was telling me how it was a pain though, because I think he's kind of on the cusp of, going over his particular level, and that he was terrified he was going to have to move out of his apartment because of this. It's quite quite enforced that if you're earning too much, you wouldn't be allowed to stay in your area, in your place.
Is that state control? The state said you were earning too much, or is it?
I think it's a local, local area.
Are there really slum areas in Charlottetown?
There were some. I didn't go around the whole area, but within the city, there were some more run. It was overall very sort of tidy. It felt like a place with a lot of money. But I did go wandering down to the kind of local bus station, and it did have quite a different feeling, and it didn't feel completely safe, I have to say. There was definitely some areas that were more run down and not as wealthy.
Is it a diverse population?
Yep. Very, very much so.
Going back to affordability, is affordability more about how much rent you pay rather than how much it costs to build the building?
Yes, because a lot of places were available to rent for people on low incomes. So yes, so when they talk about building affordable housing, it's not normally to sell, it's normally to rent out, as I understand it. Yeah. Brent, sorry.
Yes, more of a comment than anything else. I've been involved in the light rail and tram business for I've been involved in the light rail and tram business for pretty much exactly 60 years. And I've been to quite a few conferences, including several in America on light rail and various things like that. You mention the so-called light rail proposal for Wellington from their much benighted Let's Get Wellington Moving. I would only comment that it's got three major flaws and sort of breaks all the rules of good design of a rail transit system. And it's no wonder that the merchants of the Golden Mile are up against it, because and I'm sure they wouldn't be if, in fact, the thing was connected as it should be to the rest of the rail system, and the whole of the population of Greater Wellington, which is 500,000, had the option of a one-seat ride right to their shop fronts. If that was part of the design, then their objections wouldn't have much validity, but instead all they're offered is a bus highway down the middle of a struggling pedestrian area like we've got in a bit of Manners Mall. And that's hardly an attractive prospect at all. So, yeah, you've put your finger on, I think, quite an important issue there. Demetrius and I are going to see Let's Get Wellington Moving in about a week, but I don't think we'll make any difference there. Well, the three, they're basically three major flaws. The main one is that, unlike all the previous light rail proposals in Wellington, it's not part of the overall regional rail system. In other words, all it's doing is recreating, or it's proposed to recreate the old tram route to Island Bay, which was installed in 1905, and it's even worse than the original 1905 one, because it's not proposed to go down the Golden Mile, which is where most people who are going to the CBD actually want to go. Instead, it's going down the traffic sewer of the waterfront. So it doesn't even achieve a decent level of competition with car commuting from faraway places like Petone and Porirua and so on, like the original tram train proposals of the 1990s would have done. So there's no added incentive for motorists to come in by public transport instead, because they will still have to get out of the train at the existing railway station and all that sort of thing. Just because it's a modern tram rather than a bus waiting for you in Bunny Street doesn't actually improve the attractiveness for the motorist at all.
Just, and I probably should have dwelt on this a bit more. So obviously the light rail in Charlotte had been responsible for an uplift in property prices and interest in the area, and people were keener to go there, even though that area wasn't that far away from the central city. But it was formerly sort of depressed, and that came about through a combination of things. And so you could imagine, well, is this the answer to Adelaide Road, etc.? And of course, you can imagine a similar thing along Adelaide Road, but Adelaide Road is not super long. I mean, it's longish, but it's not massive. And then the rest is Burrampore and Island Bay, and you can't. It's not the same sort of setup as this area of Southend at Charlotte, where it was basically not very residential at all, but it was enabled to be residential because of adding this extra transport system. But the other point I guess I was trying to make with the map was it was explained to me that making a transit stop is quite expensive, and that's why you try and space them out as much as you can, as far as people are inclined to walk. And so, you might. I don't know if I agree about that thing about having them through the central city, because wouldn't we still want the buses to sort of pick us up more readily? Whereas a light rail to me seems like it's that mass rapid transit where you're trying to move a lot of people at speed, for quite a long distance, and that's why 8 kilometres is ridiculous. But you want a longer thing.
But because it won't be attractive to use, it won't actually be mass rapid transit. You won't be getting people from the rest of the region using it, and you won't be getting people who want to go to the Golden Mile using it.
And they're taking out bus stops anyway.
Taking out bus stops.
It'll be rapid, but it won't be mass, I think.
Anyway, we could probably talk a lot about rail, but we might just leave that for after the talk. Oh, yes.
So from online, we have from, was it, how do you say the name? Zoltan
Okay.
Someone from London.
Yeah. So the comment basically goes in here. So those who are watching the live stream can see it. Jane Jacobs came up against one town planner who determined to demolish tenement to build high-rise projects as he was playing God. Was there as a similar mission from the bureaucracy evident today in the United States, like Kaingaora does in New Zealand? Cheers.
I think it might be James. Is it a question or a statement?
I don't know.
Okay, thanks, James. Cool. Oh, okay. Sorry, Tim, was there another one from you? Yep.
One more.
Okay, yep. And we might close after that. Yep.
You don't want to respond to Zoltan? My question was actually about those urban renewal areas as well. Did you, aside from the transit, kickstarting these old, warehouse or industrial areas into residential and mixed use, was there anything that particular was done in terms of land use permissions or aggregating sites or certain rules or making the streets more pedestrian friendly? Like what made those work? What made those areas so great? We don't have many in Wellington, but I suppose
and it's
Auckland
not because you don't just magically get there. And obviously a lot of investment had been put in to make it, well, there's the artwork and the things along the side, but they did talk about how they did land swaps as well. So they were able to, because the rail corridor was relatively wide, they were able to give land to developers in return for other pockets of land where they could put in little parks or something like that, or I guess get money back. But I did notice, it doesn't seem like much, but even the railings alongside that rail trail are quite good quality, and it's not just sort of like being alongside this scummy old, train track. It's nicely done, and it feels pleasant, and of course all this sort of these fancy shops and landscaping it all adds to it. So it's not just the train. It's certainly what came with it, and that was I guess a deliberate thing that the city has done to invest in alongside that. Yeah.
So from what you're saying, it seems like their planning involved the community a lot more, but also they were more active in putting these plans together and not just leaving it to developers. Would that be right?
It appears to be the case, and I think I didn't. There was various authorities that were in charge of, the rail and also the development area as well. So but it cost a lot of money. Mm-hmm. Sorry, question over there. Yeah.
I was just wondering if there was evidence of homelessness and how that varied across these different areas, or did you probably didn't know how they deal with homelessness in this city?
I didn't see very much homelessness, but I wasn't travelling in all parts of the city, so I think there must have been some, but I didn't necessarily.
I'm just thinking of some cities I've been in the States where these nice areas that are grassed and people walk have sort of been taken over completely by the homeless, but not here.
I didn't see that, no. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for your good questions, and we'll leave it there. And thanks very much to Sam and Andre for the tech help as well.
Thank you, Jane.